Hello, BookTube. Mark at Book Time with Elvis and I are reading you a book. We are reading you The Warden by Anthony Trollope, a wonderful, adored novel of his, and we are reaching the end. We are swapping off chapters odd and even, and we are at the end of the story of what happens to the warden of Hiram's Hospital, who has decided to resign his position because his conscience doesn't sit well with the stink that has been raised about all the money that he gets for doing nothing by initially a young man named John Bold, who is also in love with his daughter. The warden's son-in-law has been adamant in defending a position that the warden doesn't want to hold. And things have come to a head. But if the man himself is decided to resign, there isn't much that anybody else can do. And we are at chapter 20, which is called Farewell. So this is chapter 20 of The Warden. On the morning after Mr. Harding's return home, he received a note from the bishop full of affection, condolence, and praise. "Pray come to me at once," wrote the bishop, "that we may see what had better be done. As to the hospital, I will not say a word to dissuade you, but I don't like your going to Crabtree." That's a small living that the warden has in his possession. "At any rate, come to me at once." Mr. Harding did go to him at once, and long and confidential was the consultation between the two old friends. There they sat together the whole long day, plotting to get the better of the archdeacon and to carry out little schemes of their own, which they knew would be opposed by the whole weight of his authority. Pretty much everyone is kind of afraid of the archdeacon. The bishop's first idea was that Mr. Harding, if left to himself, would certainly starve. Not in the figurative sense in which so many of our ladies and gentlemen do starve on incomes from $1 to $500 a year. Little jab on Trollope's part. Not that he would be starved as regarded dress coats, port wine, and pocket money, but that he would positively perish of inanition for want of bread. "How is a man to live when he gives up all his income?" said the bishop to himself. And then the good-natured little man began to consider how his friend might best be rescued from a death so horrible and painful. And some of Trollope's readers might be remembering something here at that particular moment. This is a bishop, a prince of the church. And his question is, how is a man to live when he gives up all his income? Which is exactly the instruction given by his Savior to a rich man in the New Testament. Trollope will know that some of his readers will get that. His first proposition to Mr. Harding was that they should live together at the palace. He, the bishop, positively assured Mr. Harding that he wanted another resident chaplain. Not a young working chaplain, but a steady middle-aged chaplain. One who would dine and drink a glass of wine with him, talk about the archdeacon, and poke the fire. The bishop did not positively name all these duties, but he gave Mr. Harding to understand that such would be the nature of the servitude required. It would be a kind of valet. It was not without much difficulty that Mr. Harding made his friend see that this would not suit him, that he could not throw up the bishop's preferment and then come and hang on the bishop's table, that he could not allow people to say of him that it was an easy matter to abandon his own income, as he was able to sponge off that of another man. He succeeded, however, in explaining that the plan would not do, and then the bishop brought forward another, which he had in his sleeve. He, the bishop, had in his will left certain moneys to Mr. Harding's two daughters, imagining that Mr. Harding would himself want no such assistance during his own lifetime. This legacy amounted to £3,000 each, duty-free, and he now pressed it as a gift on his friend. "The girls, you know," said he, "will have it just the same when you're gone, and they won't want it sooner. And as for the interest during my lifetime, it isn't worth talking about. I have more than enough." With much difficulty and heartfelt sorrow, Mr. Harding refused also this offer. No, his wish was to support himself, however poorly, not to be supported on the charity of anyone. It was hard to make the bishop understand this. It was hard to make him comprehend that the only real favor he could confer was the continuation of his independent friendship. But at last even this was done. "At any rate," thought the bishop, "he will come and dine with me from time to time, and if he is absolutely starving, I shall see it." Touching the precentorship, the bishop was clearly of the opinion that it could be held without the other situation, an opinion from which no one differed, and it was therefore soon settled among all the parties concerned that Mr. Harding should still be the precentor at the cathedral, which is great because Mr. Harding loves his music. On the day following Mr. Harding's return, the archdeacon reached Plumstead full of Mr. Cummins' scheme regarding Puddingdale and Mr. Quiverful. If you listen to Mark's recitation of chapter 19, you will know what all that is about. On the very next morning, he drove over to Puddingdale and obtained the full consent of the wretched clerical Priam, who was endeavoring to feed his poor Hecuba and a dozen Hectors on the small proceeds of his ecclesiastical kingdom. Mr. Quiverful had no doubts as to the legal rights of the warden. His conscience would be quite clear as to accepting the income, and as to the Jupiter, the newspaper that has helped John Bull to raise a ruckus about this, he begged to assure the Archdeacon that he was quite indifferent to any emanations of from the profane portion of the popular press. So, Dr. Grantley has convinced this impoverished cleric to take on the role of warden, rather than dispense the funds to the bedesmen who are the inmates of this charitable hospital. That he does not want to happen. Having so far succeeded, he now sounded the bishop, but here he was astonished by most unexpected resistance. The bishop did not think it would do. Not do? Why not? And seeing that his father was not shaken, he repeated the question in severer form. Why not do, my lord? His lordship looked very unhappy and shuffled about in his chair, but still didn't give way. He thought Puddingdale wouldn't do for Mr. Harding. It was too far from Barchester. Oh, of course he'll have a curate. The bishop also thought that Mr. Quiverful wouldn't do for the hospital. Such an exchange wouldn't look well at such time, and when pressed harder, he declared that he didn't think Mr. Harding would accept Puddingdale under any circumstances. How is he to live? Demanded the Archdeacon. The bishop, with tears in his eyes, declared that he had not the slightest conception of how life was to be sustained within him at all. The Archdeacon then left his father and went down to the hospital, but Mr. Harding wouldn't listen at all to Puddingdale's scheme. To his eye it had no attraction, it savoured of simony, and was likely to bring down upon him harder and more deserved stricture than anything he had yet received. He positively declined to become victor of Puddingdale under any circumstances. The Archdeacon waxed wroth, talked big, and looked bigger. He said something about dependence and beggary, spoke of the duty every man was under to earn his bread, made passing allusions to the folly of youth and waywardness of age, as though Mr. Harding were afflicted by both, and ended by declaring that he had done. He felt that he had left no stone unturned to arrange matters on the best and easiest footing, that he had in fact so arranged them that he had so managed that there was no further need of any anxiety in the matter. And how had he been paid? His advice had been systematically rejected. He had been not only slighted, but distrusted and avoided. He and his measures had been utterly thrown over, as had been Sir Abraham, the lawyer who's weighed in on the matter, who, he had reason to know, was much pained at what had occurred. He now found it was useless to interfere any further, and he should retire. If any further assistance were required from him, he would probably be called on, and should again be happy to come forward. And so he left the hospital, and has not since entered it from that day to this. And here we must take leave of Archdeacon Grantley. Now, that he has not entered it from that day to this is a pure sign when Trollope is winding things up. He will start to finish things. He doesn't leave storylines open at all. So he will just say, this person never visited this place again. Because he's done with these people, although he's not done with these people. He thought he might be when he wrote this novel. He had no idea how popular this would be. And here we must take our leave of Archdeacon Grantley. You prepare yourself for a barrage of Trollope po-face humor. We fear that he's represented in these pages as being worse than he is, but we have had to do with his foibles, not with his virtues. We have seen only the weak side of the man and have lacked the opportunity of bringing forward on strong ground. That he is a man somewhat too fond of his own way and not sufficiently scrupulous in manner of achieving it, his best friends cannot deny. That he is bigoted in favor not so much of his doctrines as of his cloth is also true. And it is true that the possession of a large income is a desire that sits near his heart. Nevertheless, the Archdeacon is a gentleman and a man of conscience. He spends his money liberally and does the work he has to do with the best of his ability. He improves the tone of society of those among whom he lives. His aspirations are of a healthy, if not the highest, kind. Though never an austere man, he upholds propriety of conduct both by example and precept. He is generous to the poor and hospitable to the rich. Unless the poor is his own father-in-law, in which case, no. In matters of religion, he is sincere and yet no Pharisee. He is in earnest and yet no fanatic. On the whole, the Archdeacon of Barchester is a man doing more good than harm, a man to be furthered and supported, though perhaps also to be controlled. And it is the matter of regret to us that the course of our narrative has required us that we should see more of his weakness than of his strength. I don't believe it. I don't know if you do. Mr. Harding allowed himself no rest till everything was prepared for his departure from the hospital. It may as well be to mention that he was not driven to the stern necessity of selling all his furniture. He had been quite in earnest as to intention to do so, but it was soon made known to him that the claims of Cox and Cummins made no such step obligatory. The Archdeacon had thought it wise to make the use of the threat of the lawyer's bill to frighten his father-in-law into compliance, but he had no intention to saddle Mr. Harding with the costs, which had been incurred by no means exclusively for his benefit. The amount of the bill was added to the diocesan account and was, in fact, paid out of the bishop's pocket without any consciousness on the part of his lordship. So these people that are connected to Mr. Harding are fabulously wealthy. They could easily support him in ways that wouldn't object to his pride. But anyway, a greater part of his furniture he did resolve to sell, having no other means to dispose of it, and the ponies and carriage were transferred by private contract to the use of an old maiden lady in the city. For his present use, Mr. Harding took a lodging in Barchester, and thither were conveyed such articles as he wanted for daily use: his music, books, and instruments, his own armchair, and Eleanor's pet sofa, her teapoy and his cellaret, and also the slender but still sufficient contents of his wine cellar. Mrs. Grantley had much wished that her sister would reside at Plumstead till her father's house at Crabtree should be ready for her, but Eleanor herself felt strongly resisted on this point. It was in vain urged upon her that a lady in lodging costs more than a gentleman, and that under her father's present circumstances such an expense should be avoided. Eleanor had not pressed her father to give up the hospital, in order that she might live at Plumstead Rectory, and he alone in his Barchester lodgings. Nor did Eleanor think that she would be treating a certain gentleman very fairly, that's John Bold, if she betook herself to the house which he would be least desirous of entering of any in the county. So she got a little bedroom for herself behind the sitting room and just over the little back parlor of a chemist, with whom they were to lodge. There was somewhat of a savor of senna, softened by peppermint, about the place, but on the whole the lodgings were clean and comfortable. The day had been fixed for the migration of the ex-warden, and all Barchester were in a state of excitement on the subject. Opinion was much divided as to the propriety of Mr. Harding's conduct. The mercantile part of the community, the mayor and corporation, the council, also most of the ladies, were loud in his praise. Nothing could be more noble, nothing more generous, nothing more upright. But the gentry were of a different way of thinking, especially the lawyers and clergymen. They said such conduct was very weak and undignified, that Mr. Harding evinced a lamentable want of esprit de corps as well as courage, and that such an abdication might do much harm and could do but little good. On the evening before he left, he summoned all the beadsmen into his parlor to wish them good-bye. With Bunce, that's the leader of the beadsmen and a dear friend of the warden, he had been in frequent communication since his return from London, and had been at much pains to explain to the old man the cause of his resignation, without in any way prejudicing the position of his successor. The others also he had seen more or less frequently, and had heard from most of them separately some expression of regret at his departure. But he had postponed his farewell to the last evening. He now bade the maid put wine and glasses on the table, and had the chairs arranged around the room, and sent Bunce to each of the men to request that they would come and say farewell to their late warden. Soon the noise of aged, scuffling feet was heard upon the gravel, and in the little hall, and the 11 men who were able to leave their rooms were assembled. "Come in, my friends, come in," said the warden. But he was still warden then. "Come in and sit down." He took the hand of Abel Handy, who was nearest to him, and led the limping grumbler to a chair. The others followed slowly and bashfully, the infirm, the lame, the blind, poor wretches, who had been so happy had they but known it. Now their aged faces were covered with shame, and every kind word from their master was a coal of fire burning on their heads. Notice Trollope is striking the same note at the end of the book as he struck at the beginning, that nothing could exceed the happiness these old men had when things were the way they were, whether they know it or not. They've disturbed their own peace. The Trollope's narrator has never had any but one position on this subject. When first the news had reached them that Mr. Harding was going to leave the hospital, it had been received with a kind of triumph. His departure was, as it were, a prelude to success. He had admitted his want of the right to the money about which they were disputing, and as it did not belong to him, it of course belonged to them. The 100 a year to each of them was actually becoming a reality, and Abel Handy was a hero, and Bunce a faint-hearted sycophant, worthy neither of honor nor fellowship. But other tidings soon made their way into the old men's rooms. It was first notified to them that the income abandoned by Mr. Harding would not come to them, and these accounts were confirmed by Attorney Finney. They were then informed that Mr. Harding's place would be at once filled by another. That The new warden could not be a kinder man, they all knew. That he would be a less friendly one most suspected. And then came the bitter information that, from the moment Mr. Harding's departure, the 2 pence a day, his own peculiar gift, would of necessity be withdrawn. So they're not only losing Mr. Harding, who even his enemies know that he's the nicest person in the world and that his successor will not be as nice, cannot be as nice, but Mr. Harding was also providing them with a little extra pocket money every day. And that will be gone. That was his own private gift to them. His new successor does not have to do that and certainly won't. And this was to be the end of all their mighty struggle, of their fight for their rights, of their petition and their debates and their hopes. They were to change the best of masters for a possible bad one, and to lose 2 pence a day each man. No, unfortunate as this was, it was not the worst, or nearly the worst, as will now be seen. Sit down, my friends, said the warden. I want to say a word to you and to drink to your healths before I leave you. Come up here, Moody. Here is a chair for you. Come, Jonathan Crumple. And by degrees he got the men to be seated. It was not surprising that they should hang back with faint hearts, having returned so much kindness with such deep ingratitude. Last of all of them came Bunce, and with sorrowful mien and slow step got into his accustomed seat near the fireplace. When they were all in their places, Mr. Harding rose to address them, and then, finding himself not quite at home on his legs, he sat down again. My dear old friends, said he, you all know that I am going to leave you. There was a sort of a murmur ran around the room, intended perhaps to express regret at his departure, but it was but a murmur, and might have meant anything, or anything else. There had been lately some misunderstandings between us. You have thought, I believe, that you did not get all that you were entitled to, and that the funds of the hospital have not been properly disposed of. As for me, I cannot say what should be the disposition of those moneys, or how they should be managed, and I have therefore thought it best to go. We never wanted to drive your reverence out of it, said Handy. He most certainly did. No, indeed, your reverence, said Sculpit. We never thought it would come to this. When I signed the petition, that is, I didn't sign it, because... Let his reverence speak, can't you? Said Moody. No, continued Mr. Harding, I am sure you did not wish to turn me out, but I thought it best to leave you. I am not a very good hand at a lawsuit, as you may well guess, and when it seemed necessary that out of our ordinary quiet mode of living should be disturbed, I thought it better to go. I am neither angry nor offended with any man in the hospital. Here Bunce uttered a kind of groan, very clearly expressive of disagreement. I am neither angry nor displeased with any man in the hospital, repeated Mr. Harding emphatically. If any man has been wrong, and I don't say any man has, he has erred through wrong advice. In this country all are entitled to look for their own rights, and you have done no more. As long as your interests and my interests were at variance, I could give you no counsel on this subject, but the connection between us has ceased. My income can no longer depend on your doings, and therefore, as I leave you, I venture to offer you my advice. The men all declared that they would henceforth be entirely guided by Mr. Harding's opinions in these affairs. Some gentleman would probably take my place here very soon, and I strongly advise you to be prepared to receive him in a kindly spirit, and to raise no further question amongst yourself as to the amount of his income. Were you to succeed in lessening what he has to receive, you would not increase your own allowance. The surplus would not go to you. Your wants are adequately provided for, and your position could hardly be improved. God bless your reverence, we knows it, said Spriggs. It's all true, your reverence, said Sculpit. We see it all now. Yes, Mr. Harding, said Bunce, opening his mouth for the first time. I believe they do understand it now that they've driven from under the same roof with them such a master as not one of them will ever know again, now that they are likely to be in sore want of a friend. Come, Bunce, said Harding, blowing his nose and maneuvering to wipe his eye at the same time. Oh, as to that, said Handy, we none of us never wanted to do Mr. Harding no harm. If he was going now, it's not among us. I don't see for that Mr. Bunce speak up again us this way. You've ruined yourselves, and you've ruined me too, and that's why, said Bunce. Nonsense, Bunce, said Mr. Harding. There's nobody ruined at all. I hope you'll all leave me friends. I hope you'll all drink a glass of wine in friendly feeling with me and with one another. You'll have a good friend, I don't doubt, in your new warden. And if ever you want any other, why, after all, I'm not going so far off, but that I shall sometimes see you. And then, having finished his speech, Mr. Harding filled all the glasses, and himself handed each a glass to the men around him, and, raising his own, said, God bless you all, and may you have my heartfelt wishes for your welfare. I hope you may live contented and die trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ, and thankful to Almighty God for the good things he has given you. God bless you, my friends. And Mr. Harding drank his wine. Another murmur, somewhat more articulate than the first, passed around the circle, and this time it was intended to imply a blessing on Mr. Harding. It had, however, but little cordiality in it. Poor old men! How could they be cordial with their sore consciences and shamed faces? How could they bid God bless him with hearty voices and a true benison, knowing, as they did, that their vile cabal had driven him from his happy home and sent him in his old age to seek shelter under a strange roof tree? They did their best, however, and they drank their wine and withdrew. As they left the hall door, Mr. Harding shook hands with each of the men and spoke a kind word to them about their individual cases and ailments. And so they departed, answering his questions in the fewest words and retreating to their dens, a sorrowful, repentant crew. Keep in mind, one of them was infirm and couldn't make it to the meeting. All but Bunce, who still remained to make his own farewell. "There's poor old Bell," said Mr. Harding. "I mustn't go without saying a word to him. Come through with me, Bunce, and bring the wine with you." And so they went through to the men's cottages and found the old man propped up as usual in his bed. "I've come to say good-bye to you, Bell," said Mr. Harding, speaking loud, for the old man was deaf. "And are you going away, then, really?" asked Bell. "Indeed I am, and I brought you a glass of wine so that we may part friends, as we lived, you know." The old man took the proffered glass with shaking hands and drank it eagerly. "God bless you, Bell," said Mr. Harding. "Good-bye, my old friend." "And so you're really going?" the man asked again. "Indeed I am, Bell." The poor old bedridden creature still kept Mr. Harding's hand in his own, and the warden thought that he had met with something like warmth of feeling in one of all his subjects for whom it was least likely to be expected. For poor old Bell had nearly outlived all human feelings. "And your reverence," said he, and then he paused, while his old palsied head shook horribly, and his shriveled cheeks sank lower within his jaw, and his glazy eye gleamed with a momentary light. "And your reverence, shall we get 100 a year, then?" So the warmth that he was feeling was greed. It wasn't anything else. It was this bedridden, dying old man is asking, "Shall we get 100 pounds, then?" How gently did Mr. Harding try to extinguish the false hope of money which had been so wretchedly raised to disturb the quiet of the dying man. One other week, and his mortal coil would be shuffled off. In one short week would God resume his soul and set it apart for its irrevocable doom. 7 more tedious days and nights of senseless inactivity, and all would be over for poor Bell in this world. And yet, with his last audible words, he was demanding his moneyed rights, and asserting himself to be the proper heir of John Hiram's bounty. Not on him, poor sinner as he was, to be the load of such a sin. Trollope wrote a whole paragraph to excoriating this kind of... and also, it's not just Bell's fault. This greed was put into him by other people. Mr. Harding returned to his parlor, meditating with a sick heart on what he had seen, and Bunce with him. We will not describe the parting of these two good men, for good men they were. It was in vain that the late warden endeavored to comfort the heart of the old bedesman. Poor old Bunce felt that his days of comfort were gone. The hospital had been to him a happy home, and it could be so no longer. He had had honor there and friendship. He had recognized his master and been recognized. All his wants, both of soul and body, had been supplied, and he had been a happy man. He wept grievously as he parted from his friend, and the tears of an old man are bitter. "It's all over for me in this world," said he, and he gave the last squeeze to Mr. Harding's hand. "I have now to forgive those who have injured me, and to die." And so the old man went out, and then Mr. Harding gave way to his grief, and he wept aloud too. Very, very somber notes as we end chapter 20 of The Warden. Mr. Harding is saying goodbye, and there are no silver linings in it. It's sad all around. It was trouble made for no reason. It was trouble made for no gain. It was trouble made by people who withdrew from it immediately. It was trouble made on the behalf of people whose lot will only make it worse by the end result, including Mr. Harding himself, who is the ultimate innocent. So that is chapter 20. It is very somber. And we will now move on. The next chapter, Mark will read it, is the final chapter of this book, where Trollope pulls together everything, all the loose ends in the story, and lets you know how things are going as he says goodbye himself. So that is chapter 20 of The Warden, and I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.